Extract 10. Violet Frankenstein. Date 1800s. It is done, but at an unexpected cost. I have been injured badly and lost an arm. Yet, I almost lost everything in this wild excursion. I have been in bed for days as we fly. Horrific nightmares plague me, both while asleep and awake. The torment of my new disability has been all-consuming. When I awake, I feel my arm, but then I look to it and it's gone, and I balk in horror and scream into my pillow. We rescued Aldous, and he has been a great comfort during this difficult time. He refused to leave my side until he knew I was well enough. I always try to convince them I am well by being strong when with them, but when alone I feel my mind may fracture from all that I have endured and witnessed. The horrors weigh so heavy on my soul that it feels like I'm caught in a net of darkness that is dragging me to the bottom of some tragic ocean of despair and turmoil. Perhaps writing once again might give me back my strength of mind, so I shall now recall all that has happened since my last entry. If I can just hold myself together until I'm back with Percy, I know his strength and comfort will help me heal. But I must distract myself. I will write what happened, but with the aching and tiredness I feel, I will write what I can and rest when I need to. After Joan called me to the deck, I went to meet her and felt the ship start to descend. I'm taking the ship a mile out of the town, she said. I have circled a couple of times, and fortunately they're still here and haven't moved on. We landed a mile out and made our way to the village with Emma's guns. Each of us had a rifle, I the Freeze rifle, and Joan the Lightning. Joan carried the magnetic pulse pistol, while I had spare charges for the rifles in a bag over my shoulder. We snuck in under the cover of darkness, trying to stay clear of any human men. We didn't want to kill if we could avoid it. Our target was the undead, the patriarch and his sons, and then we would rescue the babies and find Aldous. We made our way to the opposite side of the house where the patriarch and his sons lived. There were piles and piles of dead women at different stages of decay sprawled gruesomely all around the house, plus a massive pyramid-shaped pile to the left of the house. The mixture of what I saw and the sudden flare of rotting flesh in my nose made me gag several times. I was nearly sick, but managed to stop myself. Both Joan and I hid while we tried to adapt. After a few minutes of slow, eye-watering breathing, the smell was only just bearable. I looked over to the house again and beyond the dead bodies to where the men were sitting outside the house. I don't know how they could withstand the smell, but I guess they had grown accustomed to the foul stench of putrefying flesh. There was no sign of the patriarch and his sons. We need a distraction, Joan whispered to me as we crouched in our place of concealment. Wait here. She then darted off, cradling the lightning rifle as I waited nervously and shook with fear. But I breathed deep several times to calm myself. I took off the pack and laid it to my side, leaving it open so we could get at a new charge with speed and ease. My gaze then darted between the house and the direction in which Joan had disappeared. After several minutes, dark but just noticeable smoke began to rise from where she had been. As I noticed the smoke, I heard swift and light footsteps approaching, and to my relief, it was Joan with a grim smile on her face. That should work. And she was right. Shouts and calls came from the direction of the smoke, and the men at the house gathered to look. It wasn't long before the patriarch appeared through the enlarged doorway and barked an order. All but 3 of the guards left the house to go investigate. With the patriarch outside, some of the dead women began to move, writhe, and then rise. A few of them were so old they had no flesh and were only bones, and with others the flesh fell off their bones as they moved, and some were killed recently and had knife marks, twisted heads, missing arms, or a combination of partial dismemberment. Keep an eye on the dead, Joan whispered, and freeze them if they come near. Without another moment's delay, she then lined up a shot at the patriarch and pulled the trigger. The bright flash of lightning from Joan's rifle momentarily connected her and the house, but then the light was gone. Where the connection was made, a charred and glowing hole was as obvious as the moon on a cloudless night. The patriarch turned in shock. Then, on seeing the hole, he threw himself through the enlarged doorway, smashing the door into splinters. Joan's second shot missed him by inches, and the men started to grab for weapons. They knew where we were now. Joan tried to line up another shot, but before she could, the 3 men were coming towards us, blocking her line of fire. In that moment's delay, there came a blood-chilling roar, and the patriarch bounced back out of the house. "Stay with the children," he roared, nearly bowling the 3 men over as he pushed past them. They managed to scramble to the left and right to clear a path. I half watched the patriarch and half watched the undead women. Some had fallen back to the earth when he entered the house, but with his sudden return they began to animate. I held my rifle as steady as I could, and readied myself to either shoot the patriarch or the undead women. Joan repositioned herself. She tried to follow the patriarch with this weapon, as he didn't come straight at us. Instead, he threw himself amongst the pile of dead women. A grotesque ripple of movement then spread from the pile, and the dead women rolled off one another, forming several rows in front of the patriarch, who I could just see crouching behind them all. "Father," came the barely comprehensible groans from the dead women as they began to lumber towards us, some slipping on the patches of blood-soaked earth. Other women joined the ranks as the patriarch moved forwards. Bewildered, I failed to act, but suddenly Joan fired a bolt of her rifle, and not knowing what else to do, I pointed and fired in the same direction. Between our shots, we burned apart and froze those creatures closest to us. We shot again, and the first row was in pieces, seemingly inanimate at last. I shot again and again, taking down more with each shot. In my panic, I hadn't noticed Joan had stopped firing. Then, suddenly, a ripple tore through the air, and about 50 of the dead women fell down. The amount of corpses began to pile up, and the animated dead scrambled over their sisters. In that moment, I gained hope. We were holding them back. But from the piles of bodies emerged the patriarch, limbs, torsos, heads, and the blood of his dead women spraying in all directions. Joan shot the magnetic pulse pistol, and it hit the patriarch. His roar was cut short, and he yelped in pain, clutching at his head, but continued on towards us. I froze in terror, a silent scream smothering my hope, but fortunately my fingers locked on the gun. I pulled the trigger, falling back as I gasped. My shot hit him, and he fell stiffly, ice spreading across his unnatural figure. I watched as he came down towards Joan. She fell back too, and crossed her arms over her face and kicked out her legs, her leather coat whipping backwards. The frozen patriarch hit her boots in one big block of ice, and he fell to the side with a thud. I scrambled quickly to my feet, and remembering the oncoming dead, I turned. To my relief, with the patriarch incapacitated, they had all collapsed. I turned back to Joan as she was getting to her feet, wincing. "Are you all right?" I asked breathlessly. "My legs have been jarred, but I'm a tough woman to crack." With a wink, she dusted herself off. We both looked over at the frozen patriarch and sighed in unison with relief. Suddenly, screams from the house brought us out of our premature celebration. We saw no one at the front of the house. The 3 men who had been on guard there were gone. "Look, the window," Joan said, and I saw a silhouette of one of the sons in an upstairs window, and then he was gone. "Time for the next round of the fight," she added. I took a deep breath and saw Joan check her lightning rifle, prompting me to check the freeze rifle. Both charges were depleted, so we replaced them. As much as I don't want to, we're going to have to leave the bag and magnetic pulse pistol here. We need to be light and able to move in the confines of the house. The full charges will be enough, though. "If you're sure," I replied. She just nodded, hefted the rifle, and made for the house, moving around the piled and scattered bodies littering ground. I followed a half step behind her. We faced no confrontation as we took each step up to the porch and front door. My senses were alert, and adrenaline fueled me onwards, pounding hot through my veins like lava. At the door, Joe stood to the left of the frame and peered diagonally into the house. I did the same from the opposite side and saw no sign of anyone. It was dark, and deep shadows reached out towards us. Joan looked at me expectantly. "Nothing I can see," I whispered. "Guard the right, then. I'll take the left and the stairs going up to the first landing. Go." She then moved, and I followed, holding my freeze rifle ready for an attack. The moment we crossed the threshold, echoing screams vibrated from every direction. Not a moment later, 2 giant figures appeared from dark doorways that led to 2 opposite rooms. Ernest and Charles caught us by surprise, and shamefully I dropped my weapon in fright. Joan managed to let a wild shot out, which burned through her assailant's arm. Charles screamed in agony as Joan's wild cut ripped through his arm at his shoulder. The severed limb fell to the floor, and Charles' scream saved me as Ernest stopped in his train-like approach for a moment. Seeing what had happened, he took cruel inspiration and followed the last few steps towards me. I had no time to react, and he clutched me in his vice-like grip. He had one hand on my neck and the other just above my elbow. He then pulled with his incredible strength, and my mind exploded in pain and realization. It was too much, and the last thing I remember was prying open my eyes and trying to strain against the agonizing tension on my shoulder. With my eyes a crack open, I saw a massive blur appear to my left and fling itself at Ernest. This was the last thing I saw before blacking out. What happened after this has only been recalled to me by Joan. It was Aldous who had been the blur I saw as I fainted. He had seen the burning stable Joan had used for a distraction from his hiding place in the forest a few miles away up the rolling knolls. Aldous guessed it was us and swiftly came to investigate, arriving just in time to tackle Ernest. He stopped Ernest killing me. With Ernest pinned by Aldous, Joan swiftly turned the power up on the lightning rifle and shot straight at Charles, leaving a massive hole in his chest. He slumped to the ground, dead. With no more delay, she darted over to me, lined the rifle up, and shot down towards my gaping shoulder joint, hoping to cauterize it. The heat did burn the flesh and nerves on my shoulder and stop the blood from gushing out any more. Joan bent down and looked briefly, hoping it was enough to save me. She then watched as Aldous strangled the last of the life out of Ernest. "Take Violet," she said once Ernest was still. She saw Aldous' trembling hands and knew she had to distract him before remorse crept in. "Take Violet," she repeated. It worked. He turned to see her and quickly picked me up in his arms. "We need to go upstairs and find the children," Joan led the way. As suspected, there were several men with the children, and she told them of the death of the patriarch and 2 sons. One man nearly charged at Joan in a rage of anger, but she held up the rifle, and he stopped. "You may leave, and tell all the others to do the same," Joan told them. "What you have fought for is obtainable, but it's how you do something, not what you do, that you must focus on. The horrors and bloodshed you have been a part of sickens me, but you have one last chance. With the patriarch gone, you have no one to fuel your brutality now. Seek for fairness with women, but in a more constructive way. Destruction is not the answer here. This is my advice to you. Now go," she shouted. They listened, and with her order they left in a hurry, stealing glances back at Aldous and the 2 babies who lay in large, garishly painted cots. With this done, Joan seemed satisfied there would be no more trouble. She thanked Aldous for his return and took his hand in hers, telling him he had saved us all. With this done, they gently set me down and approached the cots to look at the baby boy and girl. Despite all the commotion, the children slept the deep sleep of innocence, both with tufts of jet-black hair, and though their skin was an off-dark yellow pigment, like their kin, it had baby fatness which softened the harshness. "I will give you a world to live on in happiness," Joan murmured, lightly stroking the cheek of the little boy and glancing up at Aldous with a smile. "Thank you for keeping your promise," Aldous replied. "I will raise them with love and peace, where no prejudice will harden their hearts. We have to get Violet back to my Zeppelin. She needs proper care. I have medication which will take away the pain and guarantee no infections. It's shameful that I let this happen, but sometimes it cannot be helped. I hope she can forgive me." "I'm sure she will," Aldous comforted, "if she is half the woman you told me she is. She will not count you responsible. We'll have to wait and see, Joan replied as she slung the rifle around her back and scooped my unconscious body in her arms. Can you manage the babies? I can, Aldous replied. They then took me back to the Zeppelin, leaving the freeze rifle on the ground floor of the house. The children woke when Aldous carried them, but they made no sound of discomfort. They are very mild-tempered, Aldous said. I'm glad. It makes this a whole lot easier, Joan replied. As they walked briskly to the Zeppelin, they saw many men with torches and bags coming and going, eyeing them reproachfully and bitterly before carrying on their way. Many were walking away from the town, and the word of how their uprising had failed must have spread quickly. When they got to the Zeppelin, Joan made sure I was in the comfort of bed and given medicine, and the babies were settled in Joan's room. She then returned to the town and let the Zeppelin rise so no one could catch us unawares, and, for added security, she made the ship invisible to all on the ground. Once she recovered the weapons and charges, and disintegrated the flesh and bone of the patriarch, Ernest and Charles, she checked the whole town to make sure it was empty. When satisfied, she then returned. From the deck, she began using the lightning rifle on a low setting to blast the houses, and watched the wood ignite and fire spread. It wasn't long before the whole place was alight, and all the corpses caught in the spreading fire. That should do it, Joan said to herself on the deck, and then walked to the helm to steer the ship on a course away from the desolation. And that is Joan's account to me of all that happened. The next thing I remembered was awakening from a dream that felt like it had lasted decades, but I had not rested at all. My body ached all over, and when I stirred, I remembered and felt the horrors of what had happened at the house. Or rather, I didn't feel. I went to move my arm and cried out in agony at my loss. I will not tell you of the anguish and melancholy feeling I had in those first days, trying to adjust to my disfigurement. It wasn't long after the initial awakening that I met Aldous properly for the first time. It shames me, but in my self-pity I struggled to find the desire to talk to him or even Joan. But after more sleep, food, and their patience, I was able to conduct myself with better decorum. I remembered the reason of this mission and how we had saved Aldous and the babies, the innocent babies who now had a chance of a free and loving life, away from the bitterness and prejudice. This, plus knowing Percy would want me to be strong, gave me the focus to be a friend and see the positives as much as I was able in my pain. I also have comfort that my mother's mistakes have been rectified, and the malicious patriarch and his degenerated sons have been snuffed out to no longer be a torment on all humanity. Now Percy and I can return to our goal to unite all those seeking for an equal companionship of love and respect between women and men in all aspects of life. Before this continue, however, we need to take Aldous and the babies to their new home. It has been an honor to get to know Aldous in this brief time, and his beautiful nature reassures me that Joan and I have made the right choices. In time, I hope I will learn to accept the loss of my arm as a cost worth paying, but it will be hard. Aldous' lovely nature has shone through in his desire to still be tied to the human race and call me family. He could easily shun us for the wrongs we have committed. In a beautiful gesture of love, he has called the babies Violet and Percy, so they will remember us, and I feel honored for such a connection to them.